Hello, and welcome to Reclamation, a Naomi Wright Ministries initiative. I am Naomi, and my team has a lot of hope for this podcast season. We want to bring awareness to the spectrum of unhealthy religious experiences and the prevalence of harm being done, as well as the need for healing for those who have been hurt and equipping for us all, so we do not find ourselves in similar situations as the stories we hear shared here. I have had the privilege of meeting several individuals from the youth group that Sarah is going to describe in this interview, and she is not alone in her experience. Many have had their faith shaken and their hearts wounded. Harmful leadership can show up anywhere. Yes, in a cult, but also in a mainstream church without proper oversight, doctrine, and practices. It is important for us to become more equipped to recognize the issue so that we can respond as needed. I hope you come away from this conversation with more information regarding religious harm than you had before. During this interview, the interviewee shared her personal story. Naomi Wright Ministries is not in any position to verify the accuracy of any allegations made, and therefore neither endorses nor embraces opinions of its guests as its own. Our goal is to provide the platform for personal stories to be shared in the hopes that it may help others. Please be aware that this episode contains profanity. Listener discretion is advised. So, Sarah, I want to highlight that not all unhealthy religious groups are hidden like mine was. I know that your church was considered to be mainstream, and oftentimes that is the case. What was the denomination of the church that you used to attend?
The church that I used to attend was a non-denominational Christian church, and I know that they started as a Baptist church, and then kind of 40 years into their maturing of a church, they made a transition and moved, and then they called themselves a non-denominational church after that. So
okay. And when did you become connected to the church?
I became connected when I was, I guess, 15, right after they made the switch over to the non-denominational title.
Okay, so you knew it as a non-denominational church. And how was that connection made?
The church started to build, they kind of started building the church, and my mom saw the plot of land where it said, like, new church coming here. And, our church at the time had started to fall apart. We were at a bilingual church at the time, and there was no real youth group or anything for the young kids. It was like an older group of people, and so my mom really wanted us to get involved in a church that had something for youth, and so that was kind of a big push in this new church's ministry. So I got plugged in there, and I was homeschooled, so I had little to no social interactions at that time, and so I think my mom saw my need for socialization. And so.
Do you have an idea of like how old you were when you started attending?
Yeah, so it was right after my 7th grade year, so the summer before my 8th grade year. So I think I was like 14 or 15 when I got started there.
And then I know you ended up stepping into more of a leadership role with their leadership team for the youth group. About how old were you then?
So yeah, right after I got baptized, I think I was 15 at the time, almost 16, right before my 16th birthday, I think. Basically after I was baptized, I came on to what was called the leadership team at that point. And that was a group of, it started as like 6 people. It was kind of the core group of students that were regular attenders that had, kind of a leadership gift, I guess, is what we called it. And they recognized my gift for worship and decided to like mentor me into this kind of leadership role, I guess. So
got it.
That was like 16, I think.
So specifically when you became involved in the leadership role, where would you say you were at, like relationally, emotionally, spiritually? Like I know when you joined the group in general, you were just really needing that outlet. You were needing that socialization. Where would you say you were at a couple years later when you got involved in leadership?
Sure. I mean, like most typical teenagers, I was not getting along with my parents. My dad and I got into like really bad fights. And so I think I was kind of looking for a mentor or someone to tell me what to do with life, you know, just a teenager kind of with no confidence and just kind of trying to understand where I fit,
right.
you know, what my purpose was in life. And so I think when I was given my guitar, I was gifted with a guitar, or I went and bought a guitar and got onto the worship team. I felt like, wow, this is my purpose. Like, this is what I'm meant to do. And it was really kind of spoken to me that way. Like, you are gifted at this. You should pursue this kind of thing. And so I think for the first time I felt like I had some sort of purpose, you know, and at the time I think I was still kind of shaky in my relationship with God. Like I was like living kind of a double life. You know, I just started my first job and like learning how to socialize after being homeschooled in my job. So there was a lot of transition at the time. And I think I really was just trying to find myself.
When you said that, someone like kind of spoke it into your life that you were gifted in worship and that's the area that you should move forward in. Who said that?
So yeah, that was my youth pastor at the time. He actually started at our church as a worship pastor. For the Saturday night service. And so when the position opened up as a youth pastor for him to come into, that's when he kind of took over. And so he led worship for our small youth group at the time with the guitar and singing. And I love to sing, you know. Mandy Moore was like my idol. She inspired
Candy?
me. Yeah, and then A Walk to Remember.
Yes,
you know,
oh my gosh, yes.
Every basic Christian girl, teenager loved that movie. So that was me in my head, you know, this, you know, innocent Christian girl that was going to meet some like bad boy you know, that would change my life. Anyways, she was my idol kind of, and I loved singing. Like that was kind of always encouraged by my family. We loved singing and dancing together. So I started singing, and he noticed that I had a gift for it and was like, hey, I want you to help me lead worship. He lent me his guitar and he said, in 2 weeks, I want you to like lead worship in front of this youth group.
Ooh,
and at that point,
a lot of pressure.
Yeah. And I had no idea how to play the guitar at that point either. So in 2 weeks, I learned how to play a few chords horribly. It sounded horrible. My first time ever playing and singing at the same time.
That was fair.
But I remember that first time that I led in front of like a room packed of people. And I was it was 3 chords I knew how to play and sing. And he stood up there with me and sang, but I played the guitar and sang. And so I don't know, to me, it felt like he was believing in me, you know, like he was like, you can do this. And my competitive nature was like, yeah, I got this, you know, so that's how it started kind of. And then I think I poured my whole self into worship and being a good worship leader. So,
yeah, I still haven't heard you sing. I'm not going to ask you to now, but just like, you know,
not on recording.
If you ever want to like send me a polo of you singing, feel free. I love to hear people sing. I love it. What about this situation made it unhealthy? So this is more of like kind of a big picture reflecting back. When you look back at this all the years that you spent in leadership, and we're going to go back and kind of break that down a little bit. But if you're looking at that kind of overarching view, what would you say were the key issues of the dynamics within that group that made it unhealthy?
There's a few. One was this guilt-driven accountability that we all were held to. I think on the starting in leadership, but then in the quote-unquote staff position that we took on after we graduated high school. It was very guilt-driven and very like, if you're not hard on yourself and like self-evaluating in a negative way, then you're not growing, really, you know? And so there was a lot of value placed on accountability and being aware of yourself, I guess, and your weaknesses in every level. And then I would say the second thing was just kind of idolizing this man who was in charge of the youth group. I think everyone really valued his opinion more than our parents, more than, other people. Like, if you were going to change jobs, you would ask him, should I do this? If you were going to go to college somewhere, you would ask him, and it was just kind of this idea that he was kind of the wisest. He was really, and I don't think he really claimed that outright, but I think the way that we were kind of, raised to fear and respect him created kind of this idolism that we had.
Yeah, absolutely. If people are good at this leadership style that we're talking about, this kind of, I'm the be all end all, and I'm the one in control, and I'm the one who's going to influence people in the way I want them to go. If someone's a good leader in that negative way, they're probably not going to say it outright. They're not going to need to. It's definitely a more subtle, passive aggressive way of like infiltrating. So that's super common for someone not to say it, but their actions and how they respond really shows it. So if this wasn't how he wanted the dynamic to be, then he may have, for example, when someone came and asked him about college, been like, well, these are my thoughts. Have you, talked to your family about it? And have you prayed about it? And what do you feel is going to be the best decision? Here's some ideas maybe to consider. So that's more of an approach of someone who's like, I want to be a mentor. I want to be available to support you, but this isn't really my decision. Like, this is yours and your family's. Right. Someone who's, you shouldn't do this or you should do that, and this is why, and is taking that more authoritative approach, they're acting it out without saying much else.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, it was just, I think more than anything, he was unaware of how manipulative he was. He was kind of what they would call narcissistic, I would say. He was a bit narcissistic in the fact that, like, if he wasn't the one who helped you make the decision, then it was probably the wrong decision, kind of thing, and he would say that you should seek God, about this, but then not really point you back to scripture, just really focus on like your character. And so I don't know, we'll probably get into it a little bit, but there was a few times where I felt like I was making the decision that I thought God was asking me to, and then I was shamed for it, So the biggest thing I think was just that we were all performing and we knew he was always watching. And so it was kind of this feeling of, I hope he says that I did something good tonight, versus like really being motivated to do it for God, kind of thing. It was just all about like, what can I do? What will be recognized, and at the core of it, I think I wanted to please God, but more than that, I wanted to please him, because he was godly in some way, so.
Yeah, that can be really confusing. I certainly had that with my dad. I'm like, well, my dad is essentially God to me. So I would ask him everything, like even as an adult. I'm like, is this okay? Do you think it's okay to take this trip or to travel? Or like I needed his blessing on it, or I was afraid something would go wrong and it was a mistake. And it's interesting because for me, because it was my father who was in that role, I wasn't seeking somebody else outside of him. Sure. But it's so much more common as a teenager to not want to hear what your parents have to say. I mean, this is like very typical and normal. And I even went through it still with my mom. Like I remember, at 17, I was like, okay, I'm done with you for this year. And then I like wanted her back again, but I had like my year of, right. I'm not interested in what you have to say. But with my dad, because again, he was my dad, but more so than my dad, he was my prophet. But again, for most teenagers, they are not wanting to hear from their parents, so they're looking for somebody else to hear from. And it's a really great opportunity for someone to step in and cause some damage and cause some harm, unfortunately. And whether it's intentional or not, there's a huge lack of awareness, and there is a huge heart issue. Like you said, if there's narcissism going on, whatever may be going on as far as mental illness goes or any personality disorders. In addition to that, though, there can be a lack of knowledge of how Scripture is really teaching us to engage others and to equip them. And we can oftentimes just get too self-focused and not be humble in our pursuits of God as we want to help other people. So it's just, you were just in a perfect spot. And so I just wanted to validate that for you, that you were kind of set up for it well, being the age you were and the dynamic of the group and being an extrovert and competitive and all these really good things. These are really great qualities that you have.
Right.
They just needed to be directed by someone who was going to do it in your best interest and in the glory of God.
Right. And that empowered me to kind of make my own decisions. I think that's also something I would warn people of, that was really unhealthy. It's just if someone is telling you that you don't know how to make your own decisions, it's probably not a very healthy situation either, because the best leaders that I've been under is someone who empowers you to feel like you've made this decision and you feel confident about it. I truly feel like we didn't realize from the get-go and then got addicted to kind of this abusive cycle.
What would you say was most valued in the leadership culture?
I think what was most valued in the leadership culture was what I kind of talked about earlier, was just self-evaluation. So self-evaluation, kind of excellence, being on time, being, I guess, competitive, not the right term, but taking initiative, but also being obedient. I don't know. It was just kind of, I don't know if I'm putting a word on it very well as I explained it before, but I remember we would have a Monday morning meeting, and we would spend 4 hours in this meeting. And the first 2 hours were dedicated to us just talking about what we needed to work on, and I remember one time one of the girls didn't really have anything to say, and her just bawling in the middle of this meeting because she was scolded and called prideful because she didn't have anything constructive to say about herself that she needed to work on. And so her character came into question because she wasn't really saying that she needed to work on anything. So just, that was one example, I guess.
Would you say that there was an environment of grace and teaching of the grace we get through Christ? Actually lived out?
It's hard to really identify. I would say we had a lot of fun. I don't think that there was grace. I just think that the fun came from making fun of each other, kind of. And I don't know. I would say no. Probably not. Probably not a whole lot of grace. I think, I don't even remember that being a word that we talked about, actually. So,
wow.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's sounding more of, it's reminding me kind of my upbringing in my household, where it was more focused on kind of the fire and brimstone and wrath and being the best possible and trying for perfection and not leaning into the grace that we have, and what Christ's sacrifice has done for us. And that doesn't mean that we don't seek to be more like him. We do, and we need God's help through the Holy Spirit to be able to even do that. And spending time in his word and having accountability in a loving way around us. But that's such an important part. I mean, it's so central to the Christian belief And yeah, I'm not hearing that so far.
No, that's
it was
a good
loving,
point.
nurturing environment where we were, things would be pointed out confidentially, but in a constructive way where we left feeling empowered, like we wanted to lean into Christ and grow.
I think we all felt like badasses all the time because we were so good at what we did.
Got it.
And so it was like this false confidence that we carried. And to this day, I feel like I still struggle with knowing, is this really my confidence, or is it like false confidence that I have just because I think I'm a badass? So I think I still struggle with arrogance because of that. But yeah, I would say, to kind of go along with what you were saying, there wasn't a whole lot of grace. And in fact, we kind of made fun of people when they messed up or they didn't, I think there was like also kind of a quiet judgment within the group, even when someone was a little different or they weren't like very competitive or weren't very, weren't very athletic. There was just this kind of quiet judgment towards them.
I'm so glad I wasn't in that church. I was like, give me some oil pastels and I'll be fine, but do not give me a ball. Like, never give me a ball.
Yeah.
Oh, you would not have been my friend. Yeah. You'd have been like, get this girl out of here.
Honestly, the funny thing is, I'm not like such an athlete. Like, I'm actually like the most clumsy person ever. But for some reason, it was empowering to feel like I could do it. So I think there was a lot of kids in our ministry that were like that. Like, one of my good friends at the time, he was really into drama. He was like a thespian, and he was just, and he was so, he hated it. Like, he hated competing in our competitions and stuff like that. But he was given like the power to like have a drama team. And he like hosted, like he was the leadership of the drama team. And he loved it because he could be in that. He could kind of thrive in that. So there were other like opportunities to thrive in what you were good at. And mine was worship, right? So I wasn't like, but the mentality behind everything that we did was very sports minded, I would say, because our leader was, like a football player in high school, and he became a coach and, all this stuff.
So while you were an active participant, because I know we're going to get to kind of like what your exits look like, but while you were an active participant, what was your view of God in relation to the expectations that were being put on your life? So did you equate what you were being told as a worship leader that, this is your area of ministry, this is the direction to go, this is the requirement on you for hours per week in the ministry, which I'm going to ask you to talk about a little bit. But in relation to all of those expectations and those requirements, where did God fit in? Did you see it as kind of top down from God coming through your youth ministry leader, or was God sort of not really on your mind in relation to these topics?
That's a great question. I don't know that I've really thought about it that much. Looking back on it, I would say I matured into this relationship with a God of my own. I really found intimacy with God on my own. But the expectation that I think was placed on us always felt like that was the expectation of God, But honestly, I think there were times where, I was disappointed in myself because so-and-so was disappointed in me, and that was not pleasing to God, or I somehow strayed off of the path that God had for me. And so I look at God completely different now than I do when I was a part of that. So I would say, like, I thought that God was talking through them, and like they had more insight into who I was somehow. One, because of their connection to God, but two, because of their connection to me. Like, I felt like this guy was a father figure in my life because my dad was pretty absent, so I felt like he knew me really well, and he could speak the truth into my life, kind of. So I really didn't do a lot of seeking on my own for what God wanted me to do until after many years after college, probably. So
Which is that also after the group too, the many years after college?
Yeah. I mean, we'll get into it a little bit, but I kind of had 2 exits from the group, but probably into my like later 20s when I was really working full time in the workforce, I recognized some things I needed to do kind of on my own to like pursue my relationship with God. And I don't think that happened till I was like 25. So like 10 years later?
Yeah. Well, and that's really, so my experience, I'm not going to really get into, but it was different than what I've imagined a mainstream Christian young girl growing up in. And so to hear that you were not really guided to that intimate relationship with the Lord throughout all of these years of leading worship and being so involved in all of these things, like it just like doesn't compute for me. I'm like, that's just so incongruent. Like you're in this mainstream church and you're on the leadership team and you're leading worship and I know like people can struggle with their daily time with God and with prayer. And I mean, we're all human. We struggle with those practices, but it just sounds like in general, it wasn't really a focus.
Well, we were pushed to that.
Okay.
In our leadership meetings, we would like do a worship time or something and then all separate and go and pray and like read our Bible kind of thing.
Okay.
So that was encouraged in our group. And then we would come back and talk about what we read or and I still have a letter today that I wrote to my pastor about like the vision that I got from God, you know? So that was still kind of fostered, you know? I wouldn't say that it wasn't, but I think ultimately we had to kind of, how do you say? Sorry.
Like accurate or
filter it through my pastor. Yeah. So.
To make sure it's accurate.
Yeah, to make sure it was accurate. So yeah, there was still a focus on reading your Bible and having your devotional time. And there were times when I was leading worship where I really felt like I was connected to God, you know, like I really felt like this is what God wanted me to do. I was connected to Him. The part that I just really felt like we misguided people on was telling them how to do it, you know, because everyone kind of does it differently, I think. And if you didn't do it this way, then you must be doing it the wrong way,
right?
You know, and so I think as I got older too, I hated that I was supposed to tell people how to worship God. Like, okay, everyone raise your hands. Okay, everyone, you know, close your eyes, whatever that looks like. And I think sometimes people need permission for those things,
right,
to be free. But other times it's used as a way to kind of force people into like a false emotion. And so I really started to recognize like guilt and shame and the Bible was used as a tool to kind of force us into this emotion where we were kind of broken down and humbled in order for him to like build us back up, our youth pastor to build us back up. And I really recognized that in the later years where he like called me out as being like a bad worship leader and saying that I had lost my gift or this or that. Like he would say just the meanest things to the point in which I would come to tears. And at that point he recognized now this is my time to like build her up. And so that was really, really unhealthy in my opinion, where it was just like, I'm going to break you down to the point of tears in order to get you to feel the emotion that I'm trying. Like it was just a control tactic in my mind. And that was much later on. But looking back, there's many times where I remembered, oh my gosh, that was used as a tool to control us, you know? So.
Oh, for sure. And that's a pretty classic abuse cycle to make someone be reliant on someone else. So if I want you to need me and to be dependent on me and I want to have control over your life, but I also want that feeling of I'm the be all end all, like I'm the big shot, that's what I'm going to do. Like it's a very classic move, and that was not okay. So I know you had said, and oftentimes it's just like one of those things we say, like I say the word so too much.
Yeah.
And so like you did say, in my opinion, I just want to let you know, like, no, that's factual.
Yeah.
And that was completely unacceptable for you to be treated that way. You have so much value and so much worth, and you should never be treated like that. So I'm just really sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
And I'm really thankful that you've come so far on the other side of such a hard experience during such a developmental time in your life.
Yeah. Yeah. Me too. I mean, I've definitely gone through a lot of testing and hurt and pain and just trying to re-explore what God wants for my life. You know, I don't think I've quite landed on it, you know, but I don't think it was what we were taught to be, like just these monster badass machines that, you know, were just on fire for God. That was another triggering word. We're just on fire for God, you know. We have to be disciplined. We have to be this. We have to be that. So,
when you exited, what was the catalyst for that? And I'm talking, and now I know you exited twice. So let me just start that over. I know that you had 2 exits from the group. So in relation to the first one, what was the catalyst for that?
Sure. So the first time I left ministry, this particular ministry, it had been brought to my attention by the people I was living with. So my youth pastor actually secured my housing for this with someone within our church. So they took me in, and I was paying them like $200 a month for rent. I didn't have a car. I had like 3 part-time jobs, and I was working for the youth group like 30 hours a week.
And was that paid or unpaid?
Unpaid.
Okay.
So I wasn't getting paid by the church, but I was there like 30 hours a week at least. But the catalyst was they brought to my attention that we sat down and did my budget. Because like in my family, we were not keen on finances. Like my dad never taught me how to do a budget or anything like that. So they sat down with me and asked if I wanted to do my budget, and we did. And I realized I was putting $200 of debt on my credit card a month. Like, so I wasn't able to pay my bills. I wasn't going to school. Like I was going to school part-time, but it was just like very like 6 credit hours a semester. It was just very slow. And then on top of it, my family, my parents were going through a divorce, and my brother was just not acting like himself. He was, you know, he had what Christians would say, he was going down the wrong path, you know. He really was in a dark place, I would say. And I realized I had, through growing so close in this ministry, I had completely like abandoned my relationships with my family. Like I wasn't close to my mom. I actually hated my dad, you know, because of some of the stuff that we were going through. And then my brother and I were close, but only because we were both in this same ministry. And I don't know how close we really were, except for the fact that we were both in the ministry together. So we were both kind of holding each other to the same standard. But I just had recognized, wow, I'm not making enough money to survive. My family's falling apart, and I'm doing the Lord's work, but like, am I really, like, is it really worth it to me to see my family falling apart and my finances falling, you know, just like I have nothing to show for it really. And so, but that was honorable. Like that was honorable to make a sacrifice for God, you know? So anyways, I at this time, my youth pastor had actually, he was out of the state, but he was still kind of over the 2 people that had taken over the youth ministry. So one was in charge of middle school, one was in charge of high school. And I think at this time we had a ministry of about 60 students. And then the staff, quote unquote, was about 15 or 20 people. So it was quite a big staff for the amount of students that we had. But I remember he wanted us all to come out to Florida for a retreat, and we called it like a leadership retreat or something. And we were going to spend time on the beach, kind of spend time in prayer, and he was going to lead it, right? So leading up to that point, I knew I was kind of going to tell him that I was quitting.
Mm-hmm.
And I had actually told both the leaders that I was going to leave. And they told me that I needed to talk to him about it, even though he was like out of state.
Mm-hmm.
So I already knew it was coming, but I went to meet with him, and I remember the whole setting, and I just told him, my family is not doing well. And my decision is to probably leave this ministry. And he basically just kind of humiliated me in front of the whole leadership team and said, that I was basically alluding to the idea that I was leaving my calling toward
Mm-hmm.
God. And so at that point, everyone was very concerned for me and my faith in God, because somehow that was connected. Like, if I wasn't going to be a part of this group, then my faith must be really shaky and shattered. And so that was the first point in which I recognized, wow, this is not healthy. This is really unhealthy. But that wasn't until 2014, I would say. So I was 8 years later,
Right,
that I recognized something's weird about this. And then my fiance, or no, not fiance, he was my boyfriend at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I remember him being invited to a night with all of our friends. These are friends I've had since middle school, right?
Right.
And I was like, oh, great. What are we going to bring? What are we going to do? And he's like, oh, well, you're not invited. And I said, well, why not? Well, you're not on staff anymore. And I was like, well, are you doing something for staff? No, we're just having a video game hangout night just for the staff. And I just didn't understand the exclusivity of it, because I was like, these are my friends I've had for so many years. But now that I'm not on staff, I'm not allowed to come to these events.
Mm-hmm.
And they were just hangout events. It wasn't a leadership conference or anything like that.
Right, with privileged information or something.
So that was when I really just recognized, wow, something's wrong. I still stayed in that church, though. So I was going to the big church, and I remember passing by youth group and everybody setting everything up and just kind of waving at them and feeling like, man, those were the good old days. But I had to work full time. I had to get a better job, and I had to make some changes and then, I became really close with my mom in that season, because she was going through a hard time. So all that to say, that was my first exit.
Would you say you kind of felt excommunicated in a way?
Yeah. I think I've always been kind of the initiator in all of my relationships. As an extrovert, I'm kind of aggressive at creating relationships with people. And I recognize that that's maybe just my role. Because once I initiate relationship with people, it usually just is really easy to flow. But I was pretty aggressive in trying to be sure that I didn't lose friendships with people. So I stayed in touch with everyone and kept having girls' nights and stuff like that with most of the girls in the ministry. But shortly after that, people started to leave. I think one of my friends who came out, he left the ministry really hurt. And then shortly after that, another friend of mine, she got pregnant and was publicly shamed, and she left the ministry. And so I think as we started to get into our late 20s, early to late 20s, we all recognized there was a lot of negative talk or trash talk about the people that started to leave our ministry, and there was something wrong with them, and that's why they left, So there was a lot of stuff that was going on. I'm sorry, I forgot the first question that you asked me.
Oh, no, you're totally fine. And then what was the catalyst for fully leaving that church altogether? So you just explained that you were still attending and in contact with a lot of people, and so you hadn't fully cut ties and gone somewhere else.
Yeah.
What was in the catalyst for that to happen?
Sure. So in 2015, I actually accepted a part-time position as a youth minister at the main church. So our youth group was kind of separated from the main church. They had their own building and everything. But I accepted a job with them and kind of recognized that the main leadership in the church was not aware of kind of what was going on in the youth ministry. And then on top of it, they were all kind of just bitter about their position. And so I worked under another pastor, and I just recognized there was just like some unhealthy things going on in the leadership itself and the like elders and stuff like that. And so that was kind of a weird red flag, but they were paying me, so I stayed, you know. But then I moved in with a single mom and her daughter, and she needed a place to go to youth group. And I don't know, I just thought at that time, I was like, well, at that time, I don't think I still thought that our youth ministry was that bad. Like, that maybe some of the leadership stuff that was going on was bad, but like they were still teaching kids about God. And so anyways, I got this great idea to take this young girl to youth group. And so I was her ride. Every Wednesday I would take her to youth group, and I would have my own Bible study time and with some other separate ladies in the church. And then I started dating her youth pastor, which was mentored by that main guy. And so I got reconnected and kind of redrawn into the group. And then I went on a missions trip with them as a volunteer, as just like a chauffeur. Since this girl was going on the trip, I figured, I'll just volunteer and go with her because it'll be fun. Like, what if she gets baptized? It'll be really cool to see her, you know. But anyways, I remember on that trip, they asked me to lead worship, and then cut me off in the middle of leading worship and said, like, we were doing a horrible job.
Oh my gosh, that's humiliating.
In front of youth kids, you know. Pulled us aside, had this, like, heart-to-heart conversation about how, like, we weren't prepared and we didn't, and I basically at that point was ballsy enough to call him out and say, you set us up to fail. You know, you basically set us up to fail. So what did you expect? And he accused me of having an attitude with him. And I got to the point of where I started to have tears in my eyes, not just because he was coming down on me, but my boyfriend was standing right next to me, like letting me kind of take all of this. You know, he had no guts to really stand up for me. And then he just accused me of quite a few other things, you know. And so I mulled it over in my head. And later that night, I came back to him because I wanted to resolve it because I felt like it didn't get resolved. And he basically said, like, I needed to make this sacrifice. If I was willing to date and continue my relationship with this guy that I was dating, who was his mentor or whatever, then I needed to understand my place, kind of. And I apparently somehow stepped out of my place and was disrespectful. So later on that night, I went to apologize to him and say, you know, I'm sorry if I came off as having an attitude, but I just want you to know this is the circumstance and this is what happened and that's why it happened. And I just feel like you didn't really hear me, you know, but I want to apologize if I had a bad attitude. And he laughs at me and basically says to everyone within ear distance, like, that basically just mocking me and saying, like, that's not a real apology. You don't really, you know, you're like, and I don't remember exactly what was said, like, at the time. I just remember going to bed that night and my boyfriend, like, looking at me with disappointment, like I had done something totally out of, like that I had completely failed them. And so I just remember the whole rest of the trip, like, just a pounding in my gut of, like, something is really wrong. This is really not healthy. Like, I don't understand why this man has so much power over so many people. Like, it's toxic. Like, he had just gotten to such a bitter, angry place because of where his ministry had fallen, that he was becoming toxic to everyone else around him. So I would be more inclined to say that he became more unhealthy as time went on. I don't think he started that way. I don't think he started with an intention to be mean or to be controlling. I think he really started with the heart of, like, wanting to serve God. But over time, I think he just became more power hungry. And the more and more he lost control of things, the more and more, like, angry and bitter I feel like he became. And so I finally sorry, this is a long kind of stint, just to say that like I came to the realization that he was not acting under God, and God would not ever treat anyone this way. And so I wrote him a letter, and I brought it to my boyfriend's attention, and he basically called me crazy. And at that point I realized like I needed to be done. And so I was supposed to be helping lead like the youth group worship practice. The next day was like going to be the first day to start this new youth worship practice that my boyfriend had asked me to help him with. And I remember thinking, I can't do it because I know who's really in charge, and I can't do it. So I called him that morning and said, hey, I need to break up with you, and I'm not coming back to the church. And I never stepped back in the church. Like after that moment, I left my small group. And at that point, like I had been told not to go to my small group and talk to them about anything that was going on because he was a youth pastor at our church. And so he didn't want me to paint him in a poor light. So I had been alienated from my connections to the church anyways.
Well, and the biggest concern I have when I hear you tell the story from a leadership perspective is in regards to his apparent lack of leadership. It sounds like what you're speaking to, like no one really knew what was going on. And maybe they had their hands too full to really get into it, or they saw that it had grown from 6 to 20 people in leadership alone. And so it looks like it's successful, and they're not really investigating, well, what are the methods that are being used to make that happen? Is it control? Is it manipulation? Is it gaslighting at times? Like, what are the methods that are being used to have this kind of dedication out of these kids? And is the dedication healthy? Is the amount of time realistic? It's more of, oh, this is growing and it's successful. So, and I don't want to project, I don't know exactly what was going on. It's just, this is kind of the picture that it paints in my mind. Whatever the real reason was, whatever the real circumstances were, this man certainly was not getting the oversight that he required. And that is a reoccurring theme that I'm hearing in these conversations with people such as yourself that I think needs to be brought to light. Oftentimes people do have good intentions, but they're learning and growing themselves. And if they don't have an older mentor who is solid, God-honoring, loving people the way they should be, equipping and pouring into people in a proper way that's healthy and encouraging, then it all kind of falls apart. Yeah. So we can have too much trust in people in a way that doesn't actually serve and help them. We need to be present in those leaders that are quote unquote underneath us, so that we're really pouring into them and we're helping them. So whether this man was just a horrible person and out to get everyone, or whether this was someone who just went in a bad direction because they needed more oversight, either way, more oversight was needed because you were harmed in the process.
Yeah.
And that's
not
unacceptable.
Only me. There's like a group of probably 15 people that I would say, looking back now, would say that it was an abusive situation. So I know I'm not alone. I'm probably the first one to say it out loud or whatever. But,
well, and as you know, I myself have met more than one individual from this experience, and absolutely they say the same thing. They're like, this was very unhealthy and it was abusive, and they have similar stories to yours. So absolutely, you're not alone. There's nothing about what you're saying that is crazy. And again, you're worth so much more. It's never acceptable.
Well, and so I don't say that with, I think that's the other thing. Like, he had so much potential too, I think. And that's what makes me leery about churches now in general, is like, I think people have so much good intention, but we're all sinful, right? And so our sin nature takes over. And if no one's holding you accountable to that, like, I mean, you see it in all kinds of leadership all over the place. If you don't have accountability, like, you can turn into a scary person very quickly. And I can myself, you know? And so I think it was just, like that he didn't have any accountability to anyone. And at the last point in time, he wasn't even accountable to anyone on our church leadership because he was living in a different state. And they were just paying him to host these camps and these mission trips.
Right.
Just blindly. I was like, wow, it's probably we should probably be a little more concerned, so.
Well, and you just said that you're leery of churches today. So I just want to segue into that a little bit more. In what ways does this experience continue to impact you negatively today?
Sure. I think you could ask both of my brothers. They would probably agree with you in this and saying that I am really turned off by like church lingo, even though I use it sometimes. Like I hate when people use like certain terms, like we're family, like we have to keep each other accountable, like we are the body of Christ or things like that, where it's just like no person that hasn't been in a church would understand what that means. What does it mean to be the body of Christ? That's a weird term, right? You only know that if you read the Bible and if you talk about it. And so I think I'm really turned off by Christians that are people and churches that are oversaturated, I guess, in this Christian culture, that they don't even recognize that it's a turnoff to the rest of the world, And so I think when I go into churches, I'm very critical of the pastors. If they say anything about giving and tithing, I'm immediately like red flagged. Or if they say anything about like, we are your family, you can count on us. I'm very leery too, because I think you can't promise that to anyone because life changes so rapidly. I can't say like, I'm here for you forever, and that's kind of what our group promised us, is that we would always be together and we're just this strong group of people. And like some of those relationships have sustained, but most of them are gone, and most of those people are hurt and bitter and angry about what happened. So
I know we've talked about this a little bit outside of this conversation, but I have some trigger words too that I've worked to diffuse and it definitely takes time. There's certain words where I'm just totally turned off and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's just a bunch of garbage. Like I don't want anything to do with that. I don't even know what that means. Like, what does that even mean? Because when I see you live it out, it doesn't look like it means anything. So, like that, I get you. Like I get where you're coming from, and I know our words are different, but we both have them.
What is your word?
One of mine is community.
Community.
Yeah.
Mine would be family, probably.
Community's probably been my biggest one. And also that saying, let's do life together. I'm like, what is that? How do you do life? Like you live, like, what do you mean you do life? Like, I don't understand it. So, but I have learned, and I really truly like accept this. Like, this is really like in my heart at this point. It doesn't mean that I'm still not like a little hesitant or something when I hear these words. And I think having some hesitancy is healthy. I think not just jumping into things and kind of observing a little bit and having a little caution can be a healthy thing. But I have come a long way with those trigger words. And first of all, I know that it's not the words themselves that are the problem. They're words. It's the experiences I've had in relation to those words that's the problem. True. And those are isolated incidents. Now, I might have a whole bunch of them from one group experience or one church experience. I could go to a different group of people, whether it's a church or just friends, and maybe end up believing with 3 new trigger words that are totally different.
Right.
And that is life.
Or the same.
Yeah. I mean, and that is life. Like I could probably come up with a couple words in my relationship with my husband where I'm like, I just don't even want to hear that because you never actually follow through or whatever, those like marriage dynamics. And so what I have found to be the be all end all in me being able to move forward and find community and find family as someone who does not have involved extended family. I've been able to find those things and have more fulfillment in my life in those areas versus maintaining that loss. I've been able to find that by relying on scripture first and foremost. If I know how to properly read my Bible and I read my Bible, then I can walk in literally anywhere and check it out and know this is off, this is off, this is off, this is on, this is on, this is on.
Right.
And the things that are off, they're deal breakers or they're not.
Yeah, right.
And some are and some aren't.
Because no place can be perfect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And are people receptive to a conversation? If I'm like, hey, you know, like the way that came across this way for me, and maybe you didn't even intend it that way, but for me, I received it that way, and it could be because of my perspective and, you know, my triggers and my hurt. But I want to talk about it, and seeing how that person receives that conversation. That's really what it's about.
Yeah.
Like, we're going to step on toes. That's bound to happen. But how do we handle that? You did not see that modeled well at all.
Yeah,
it was modeled
question
terribly.
Anything. Yeah.
Yes. So to me, and it's so funny because when I married Michael, we were both a hot mess. But of course, I wasn't aware of what a hot mess I was. I was very aware of his hot mess. So I was like, okay, like literally, I can't remember if this was right before we got engaged, but like I knew it was coming. And I was like, I need a few days of not interacting to just like be with God and decide if I'm even going to if I'm going to move forward and marry you. Because there was just a lot of unhealthy dynamics going on individually for each of us. And ultimately I knew that this man loved God more than anything else. And I knew that he was willing to humble himself and learn and grow and apologize. And so I'm like, okay, then we're going to be able to work through anything.
Right.
And he knew that I had that as well. We both do.
Right.
And we've been together for 8 years, 7 years married now, and it continues to get better and better. And that to me is what we're looking for in other people. Are they putting God first, like the best that they can? Like that's what they're trying for. And they're willing to have those hard conversations and humble themselves and receive in a loving, healthy environment.
Sure.
From there, amazing things can happen.
Right.
And I want to offer that to anyone listening and to you, and as a reminder to myself to hear it, that when I walk into a church, I'm never going to find perfection. But if I find people who are genuinely like seeking God and they're looking at scripture to do it and they're sound, they're doctrinally sound, there's going to be other stuff that's going to come up, but we can get past that.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I would go a step further, and maybe this is just like some triggering thing too, that we were kind of taught in church, is that like non-Christian people add no value to our life or challenge.
So untrue.
I know. And so I think that's the other thing that I really learned through my friends that aren't Christians, that would never walk into a church, that they have so much to teach me too. And so I think that was another arrogant thing that I faced, is that like people, quote unquote, without God can't challenge us or can't. And I would challenge that idea, I guess, and I do think that it's important to be married to someone who has the same faith base, because you have to do everything together. But for friends, you don't necessarily have to do everything together. And I don't think you have to agree on everything or be in the same heartbeat as things. But I think that was one thing I really got challenged in. Anyways, I would just go like one step further to people, especially Christians, I would challenge just to see that God made every person. And so each person has value to bring to your life. And I think that saying that some non-Christian person doesn't have a voice in your life is, maybe it's not in the same capacity as like a mentor or something else, but they have a lot to teach you. So I think that's the other thing that I would encourage people, is just like, you see in the Bible, the beggar or the tax collector or the prostitute, they are prime examples of people being taught a lesson in the Bible, and not just that they were a part of the lesson, but they taught other people a lesson. And so I think Christians overall and people in the faith community should approach it very humbly and recognize that like even people outside of your faith have the opportunity to challenge you, you know, and And that's like a lie I believed for so long, that like I can't have any non-Christian friends unless I'm ministering to them. There's no way that I should be friends with them because they're a bad influence on my life. And it's like, to me, that's really sad to hear out of Christian people too, because I feel like you miss out on opportunities to learn. You miss out on opportunities to comfort someone. You miss out on opportunities to be comforted, you know, so.
Just love people.
Yeah. So, I don't know. Sorry, that's my little soapbox.
If you were to issue your loved ones or possible future children a warning in hopes of them never finding themselves in a similar situation, what red flag would you want them to be aware of?
Like in a religious setting or just in any setting?
Right. If you were thinking back on your experience and you're like, I want my future child or my younger sibling or a good friend, like I would want them to know this as a red flag so that if they ever stepped into a similar environment, they would be like, oh no, I'm going somewhere else.
I would say if you can't ask questions about why you believe something, or ask maybe a challenging, critical question toward whoever is in leadership, that would be a red flag without suffering some type of, you know, emotional, you know, sometimes it's scary to challenge people. And I know a lot of my friends are not like, they avoid conflict like the plague. I'm very confrontational, but I know a lot of people that aren't. But I would say, like, even if you can't ask like a simple question of like, why do you believe that? Or why do we do it this way? Without being like made fun of or criticized in some other manner, then that's probably an unhealthy setting to be involved in, you know? And then, and I think it goes back to like the biblical thing. Like if someone has, this is like in the Bible, but basically if someone has wronged you, go to them and tell them. And then if they don't listen to you, then bring someone else to be a witness. And then lastly, if that person doesn't listen, bring someone in leadership with you to confront that person. And if at that point nothing's changed, then you need to leave. And so I would just encourage people to kind of follow that too. Is just approach conflict in that way, I guess.
Right.
Because there's going to be conflict. It's inevitable where people, you know, we disagree with each other. But I'm taking that same approach right now in my work setting. So
yes, it applies. It applies everywhere. And for anyone who wants to check that out and read more about what she's specifically talking about, that is in Matthew 18. And it is one of my favorites. And partially it's one of my favorites because it's just so easily applied to today. It's very straightforward. And I've used that model several times, actually. And no, it doesn't always end the way I would hope it would. Yeah. But I can be at peace knowing that I've really tried.
Right. You've done everything.
Yes. And that was a beautiful way, I think, to summarize what your experience has been. And I completely agree. If you cannot ask questions without repercussions and without negative consequences, that is absolutely a red flag and you should go somewhere else. So thank you so much for recording this with me twice and a little bit of extra because the first few questions didn't record. I really appreciate your vulnerability, and it's just so cool for me to get to hear where you've been and then hear and see where you are now. It's a gift and a treat for me. So well done.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this production of Naomi Wright Ministries. You can learn more about us by visiting naomiwrightministries.com. Please note that any opinions represented by this ministry are not to be mistaken as medical or professional counseling advice or services. Employees, volunteers, representatives, guests of Naomi Wright Ministries may be individually trained, authorized, or licensed to provide professional counseling, psychological treatment, or psychological diagnoses. What you are listening to or viewing is not the provision of any such services. None of the interviews represented here creates a counselor-counselee relationship.